So I think that we'll get started. A very warm welcome to this COG-UK Women in COG event. And I'm delighted to have Judy Breuer here to speak with us today. Just to let you know that my name is Sharon Peacock. I'm a Professor of Public Health and Microbiology at the University of Cambridge, and I'm also the Director of COG-UK. So just starting to give you a few housekeeping meetings. Now, we're recording this session and the interview will be going out onto our YouTube channel, just to let you know. We're going to be having a 30-minute Q&A between Judy and Dr. Catherine Ludden, who is a Director of Operations at COG-UK. And then there'll be an opportunity to ask Judy questions. And so when we get to that point, do ask your questions. You can put them in the chat, or you can put your hand up, or just come into the conversation. So we really do encourage you to ask questions at the end. Just sort of the usual Zoom etiquette. If you could keep your mute on, you can keep your screen on or off as you wish, but that will allow the meeting to go swimmingly. So just to say that it's an absolute pleasure to have Judy speak with us today. What I would say is that Judy and I go back about, I think, is it 20 years, Judy, probably? Perhaps 25 years. We've been working together since then. And you'll hear more about Judy's bio in a minute, but for me, she's an absolute legend in clinical virology. So Judy is an academic clinical virologist, and she has done so much to bring the discipline forward, actually. And I've also seen Judy really mentor people, mentor them through kind of STEM subjects and actually really support their career, which is why it's so wonderful to have her here today, because she really is an ambassador for women in STEM and supporting them. So at that point, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Catherine Ludden and invite Judy and Catherine to start their Q&A conversation. Now, I'm so looking forward. I was saying to Judy before we came on out, I'm so looking forward to hearing some of your background. I think it's going to be absolutely fascinating. So over to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Sharon. And I myself are very looking forward to chatting to Judy today and hearing more about her story. As a researcher, I think Judy has really been an inspiration to many people, and I think her story will be very insightful to everybody on the call. I'd like to start by giving a quick bio to Judy of her story, and then we can talk in more detail as an informal chat. So Judy is COG-UK PI at University College London, where she's Professor of Virology, as well as PI in a Wellcome Trust Collaborative Award exploring why norovirus causes pandemics. Research in her lab focuses on the application of next generation sequencing and phylogenetics to study virus diagnostics and discovery. Her lab at Great Ormond Street were the first in the UK to introduce metagenomics for the identification of viruses in cases of encephalitis, and are now using this routinely on many specimens. Professor Judy Breuer is Chief Investigator of the COG-UK Hospital Onset COVID-19 Infection Study, abbreviated as the HOCI study. And we are delighted to have her part of COG-UK, but also to have her join our second Women in COG event today. So Judy, thank you very much for joining and for agreeing to share your story. We'll have an informal chat for about 25 minutes. And as Sharon said, we'll open up then to everybody in the audience to ask some questions. Please do post your questions in the chat. I'm sure we won't be able to cover everything today, but we'll try capture as much diversity as we can. And if you'd like to ask questions in person to Judy at the end, you're very welcome to. Just please raise your hand. So Judy, we best get started. And I think
thank you very much for inviting me. It's such an honor to be here. It really is wonderful.
Thank you, Judy. It's an honor having you. You really are just an amazing role model to so many people. I think we best start at the early years to kind of capture to see what it was like, how young Judy was. So it'd be really good, Judy, if you could just tell us a bit about what life was like growing up for you, and how did you become interested in STEM?
I had a very happy childhood, no traumas that I can think of, very, very sort of comfortable, happy background. I I liked science at school, but I liked all subjects. Actually, I was somebody who was really quite interested in lots of things, and I still am a hugely avid reader. For example, I read a book, every 2-3 days. So I retained an interest in lots of areas. I think that I came from a family of scientists. So both my parents were chemists by training, and I had a grandfather who was an engineer, and uncles and cousins who were engineers and mathematicians. So it was kind of expected that I would go into science, and I slightly rebelled by going into medicine. Actually, I mean they thought that the only way to go was pure science. They'd earmarked for me, and at one time I was going to be an electrical engineer, and they thought that was a good thing to do. And then I just decided I wanted to do medicine. And I didn't decide till quite late. Actually, I was already doing maths, physics, chemistry at A level. And then I suddenly said, I want to do medicine. I want to do biological sciences. And so I had to take biology O level in about 2 terms, because I didn't even have biology O level, so I couldn't have got into medical school. So it was kind of expected that I would go into science, and I slightly rebelled by going into medicine and biological sciences.
And Judy, we're very glad that you did, which we'll get onto later, about the huge impact you've had on patient care. And in terms of when you were younger, Judy, was there anyone in particular that you've seen as a role model that would have really encouraged you to go into science or into medicine?
Well, actually, I have to say that my mother was somebody who was always immensely influential. She was a physics and chemistry teacher, and she'd started a PhD, which she'd given up when she had me. And she didn't really mind giving it up, because she wasn't hugely ambitious, but she was very clever, and she might have done a PhD under other circumstances. But I think she kind of sort of expected that, she was very, very encouraging of going into science, really enjoyed it. She enjoyed being a scientist, had come from a background of nobody, very sort of poor background, and had made it through to becoming a physics and chemistry teacher. And she was very keen that I do science, and also very keen. She was the one person who was very supportive of me doing medicine. I mean, not to say that everybody else wasn't, but she was positive about medicine. And so, yes, I think she would be a role model. She was somebody who was a sort of housewife some of the time, and really resented not being able to work, as much as she could. So she was very, very positive about my having a career.
I think that's lovely to hear, Judy, and I'm sure she's very proud to see that even if she couldn't pursue the career in science that she may have wanted, that you've definitely gone on and to do as I'm sure that she would love to have done. So it's really nice to see that role model. Judy, for your undergraduate, you've touched on that when you did your postgrad, you went on to do medicine. But just if we start a bit backwards about, how did you choose your undergraduate, and then what kind of subjects did you particularly like, and did that pave your way forward to where you went next?
So I went straight through medical school. I had no intention of doing any research at all. I was absolutely determined I wanted to get out there and treat patients. So I didn't do a BSc or anything like that. But I actually always enjoyed, I particularly enjoyed biochemistry, and I enjoyed anatomy a lot. And I enjoyed pathology. Actually, my favorite area of work at medical school was pathology, and actually particularly within that, hematology. That was really my favorite. So it was really sort of on the borders between medicine and pathology. And I had some very inspiring teachers at medical school, one of whom actually was Sally Davis, who then went on to be Chief Medical Officer. And she was one of the people who taught me hematology at medical school. I mean, she won't remember me, but I remember her. And she and a couple of her colleagues were absolutely excellent teachers. And I was all set to do hematology, although the other area I did enjoy at medical school was virology. In fact, we had, again, some very good teachers, one of whom had come from Glasgow from the Centre for Virus Research at that time. And Richard Tedder was also a teacher when I was at medical school. And so I enjoyed all of those. And that probably shaped where I went later on. So yeah, that was very influential.
And is there a reason, Judy, why you chose to go down the route that you did instead of hematology, that you mentioned that you also liked?
Well, I was planning to do hematology, and actually I really like pediatric hematology. And then I did a neurology job at the Middlesex Hospital, and I looked after, I think, one of the first HIV patients who had a toxoplasma brain lesion. He was a GP, and he died of his toxoplasmosis. And I was the SHO registrar looking after him. And I suddenly thought, this is really interesting. I'd like to do this. I'd like to do some more about infection. I'm really interested in HIV. And at that time, there weren't very many infectious disease jobs, and I had already had a small child, and so I couldn't really move. I mean, there were really very few in London infectious disease jobs. You had to move, and I couldn't do that. So I went into microbiology at that time, and I enjoyed it, but I didn't really enjoy it as much as I had hoped I would. But then when I did a 2-week attachment in virology, I suddenly remembered that I really enjoyed virology, and I suddenly remembered I really enjoyed HIV, and I just decided that, that was what I wanted to do. So that was really informative.
I think that also shows, Judy, how important it is to be exposed to all these diverse disciplines. That reminder of virology of kind of, reminds you about how interested you are in it, and that was necessarily the career for you. I'm sure you could have gone into many careers, but I think having that going back to the virology training and to really remind you about where you wanted to go. Judy, I'm going to move on a bit towards the research, because we talked about how you really are passionate about medicine, and that's where you knew you were going to go. But when did you actually decide that you wanted to go into research, and how did you choose what research you wanted to go into?
Well, I made a decision I wasn't going to, because the whole of my family is in research, and including my husband. And I just thought, there's too many researchers. I just need to get on and do, proper medicine. But I think in the end, you are either somebody who likes research or you're not. And I couldn't help myself but ask questions the whole time. And I was continually coming up against things that I wanted to know the answer to, and didn't really have the tools to deal with it. So I decided that what I'd better do, I was going to go and be a clinical virologist, but I thought, I'll do some research while I'm doing clinical virology. And so I thought what I'd better do is go and do a bit of research somewhere. And I was very lucky. I was lucky enough to get a sort of clinical fellowship, or it was a sort of fellowship to go and work at the National Institute for Medical Research in Mill Hill on HIV. And I decided I was going to go there and just do some research, get some idea, learn how to read papers, learn how to think about research questions, and then go back to clinical virology and use it. And of course, once I'd done some research, I suddenly realized that I actually really enjoyed it. And I only spent 2 years there for various reasons. Mainly, I felt I'd learned what I needed to learn. I didn't need to do a PhD in those days. If you had a medical degree, you didn't actually have to do a PhD to go on and do research. And I thought, oh, I know enough now. Probably that wasn't true at all, but I felt that I did. So I only did 2 years, and then I was lucky. I managed to get an MRC grant as soon as I left, and so I got a senior lecturer position. I had an MRC grant. I had some papers, so I kind of launched myself on my research career. I mean, you couldn't do that nowadays, but in those days, it was possible. And then I managed to get funding ever since. So that's really what propelled me. And it was really about asking questions. It was about saying, I'm interested. Why is this happening? What's going on here? And I'd like to know more. I want to find that out. And that's really been the thing that's propelled me all the way through.
You used the word luck there, Judy. I noticed, and I'm sure it wasn't all about luck. You mentioned there about needing to identify the research questions and use your experience. So I think you're very modest when you say about luck and how it continued to lead on to more grants. I think anyone who knows you knows that it's built on hard work and actually being able to know what really does need to be researched that will impact on patient care. And I think one thing that would be nice to hear about is, how do you use your interaction with patients to shape those research questions?
Well, that is how I do research. I mean, I'm very much driven by my clinical experience, and I've been very lucky that I've worked in places that have extremely interesting biological questions just amongst the patients. So I did my research initially on HIV-2, and when I left, I got a grant to work on that a little bit longer, and that was great because I got to establish a relationship with the MRC unit in the Gambia, and got to travel out there and work with people out in the Gambia. And that's seeded for me a lifelong interest in working with colleagues all over the world. But I realized that I couldn't really work on HIV-2 in the UK because I would have had to work on HIV-1 as well. It was a crowded field and I was newly starting out on my own. And so I became interested in varicella zoster virus because I was involved in the care of a number of adults who were admitted with chickenpox, who died of chickenpox. And this seemed to me extraordinarily unusual because I think, we think of chickenpox as a childhood illness. And I decided to try and work out what was going on. Was this a host thing? Was it a virus thing? And I started with the virus because I had lots of access to the virus. And that sort of shaped my career from then on, because my interest has always been the viral determinants of clinical outcome, including things like transmission and also pathogenesis. And I worked for many years on VZV, and I think I became probably one of the people who was most expert on the molecular epi of the disease, and then the vaccine. I also became sort of very involved in the vaccine, and that's a very interesting issue because the vaccine is a mixture of strains, and we inject this vaccine mixture into people, and that provides immunity, and how that works was something that occupied my mind for a long time. And basically, yes, and that's led on in various ways to what I do now, actually, completely.
And Judy, I know that you've been largely based in London throughout your career, but you also mentioned your connections to global partners. And I'm wondering, what advice can you give people? There's a lot of pressure to stay, to keep moving as researchers, but you also managed to stay in the place, but become connected with other people. So what advice can you give to people about that?
Well, I worked, at the time I was really having to move jobs as a young medic. You have to move every 6 months to possibly most is 2 years. And the only way that I and my husband, who was also training in medicine, could do this was to actually work at every part of London. So we worked in hospitals all over London. So I feel I'm a real Londoner. And we didn't want to move cities because we had kids and it was difficult. So we managed to get jobs in every part of London. And so I really am one of those people who has worked and has driven around any part of London. So I can more or less find myself, I regard myself as a true Londoner. I wouldn't say that's necessarily the best thing to do. I think it's very good to go and work in other places if you can. But I think if you can't do that, and there may be reasons why one can't, then it's really good to establish good collaborations with people in other labs, in other countries, and to work closely with them, because then they feed your ideas, and you've just got to be open and not proud, not afraid of making a fool of yourself. I mean, I tend not to be afraid of making a fool of myself. I just, feign ignorance and I think that's a really important thing, because you can't know everything, and there tends to be a sort of slight inbredness if you're in one community the whole time, but inbreeding. But I think if you can work with people, especially all over the world, and I've been so lucky to work with people literally in every continent, and that's been really enriching.
Thanks, Judy. I think it's fantastic to hear about. If you do stay in one place, it's important to make those collaborations, and also there is advantages to moving around. It just depends on the individual and the circumstances, which is going to move on to my next topic. Of you mentioned that you've got children, and of course we all know that sometimes it can be difficult to have a family and also be successful in science in particular. Did you find it difficult to manage family life with also progressing your career? And was there any particular challenges that you had to overcome relating to the family?
It's always difficult, and things are much better now than they were when I was training. And I think it's completely underestimated what the difficulties are. I mean, having a child is not just the time that you're, looking after the child and you're on maternity leave. When you come back, there's getting your brain in gear and trying to juggle childcare and the guilt feelings. For years I felt guilty about the fact that I'd worked full time all the way through, and fortunately my kids have turned out okay. So I can confidently say that working full time and having children doesn't screw them up necessarily. I mean, my advice is always, a lot of people ask me this, and my advice is always, do not sacrifice your family. Just do not. I mean, people ask me, when is the right time to have children? There is never a right time to have children. It's always inconvenient. There's always something that you will have to compromise on. But you should just do it when it feels right to you, because there will be a way through. And sometimes one has to tread water a bit. Less so these days. I mean, there's much more support around, and especially if you can find mentors who can fight for you, who can say, you really are entitled to this and you really should do, you can do this, then that's helpful. There were fewer of those around when I was growing up, but I think that you've just got to keep thinking that you can do things and not worry about what your family are, how your family are impacting, because there are an awful lot of people who hit the buffers in their careers for all sorts of other reasons. I mean, there are huge numbers of people who run out of ideas. They seem to be very good scientists, but then they stop having ideas. And so, if you're someone who's got ideas and wants to do science, you'll find a way through. You need to just sort of keep hold of that belief and not sacrifice your family. Don't do anything that you will regret later. You can always recover your career. You won't be able to recover, problems that you've created with your family, easily. So that's my advice. And go and talk to good mentors who can help see the way through.
Thank you, Judy. And I think that is a nice reminder to everyone the importance of having a mentor and thinking about what you want personally and also what you want in your career. So, thank you for sharing that advice to everybody on the call today. You spoke about ideas. So I may be asking you a tricky question now, but what are your goals for the future and ambitions, learning from what you've already done, and how are you going to go forward?
Well, I like what I do now. My interests are varied. One of the things I'm very interested in doing is pulling the genomics, because that's what I do, through into clinical practice. And I was so privileged to have the opportunity to run the HOCI trial through COG-UK, which I think is going to be one of the few studies that will provide granular data on where we are with using sequencing for infection control, and what works, what doesn't work, and what we can do to make it work. And I'm really excited about that, especially given that there's so much genomic data now being generated as a matter of course, with all the sequencing by PHE. We're now asking our questions, how can we use that for clinical care? And I'm hoping that the results of the HOCI study will actually inform that. I'd love to see genomics and other technologies widened to many pathogens. I mean, my interest is still infectious diseases. And then I also have interest in pathogenesis. I've always, since I started working on VZV, I'm a herpes virologist. And I started doing genomics really because I had questions about VZV pathogenesis. I wanted to know, it doesn't have an animal model, and I wanted to know what happens when the virus goes into a person and then causes chickenpox or zoster. And I used genomics to answer those questions, and I developed a targeted enrichment method to answer those sorts of questions. And I'm still interested. I'm working at the moment on, I think I found the mechanism of action of the vaccine virus. I think I've found out the protein with which it interacts in the skin. So I'm working on that. And then I've got a program of work on cytomegalovirus, which is really fascinating, which is looking at the viral determinants of congenital transmission and that kind of thing, whether we can actually see the reflection of host immunity and host variability in the selection of strains that are associated with congenital or postnatal transmission. So that's one thing I'm looking at. And then I've got this grant on norovirus, which is again asking questions very similar to what we're now asking with SARS-CoV-2. Where do pandemic strains come from? Where do new variants come from? It's the same question. And we were doing that with a mixture of serology and genomics and mathematical modeling. And that's still something that, you know, I would like to continue to do. So diverse interests, but working on things that I hope will have clinical impact eventually.
Sounds like you'll be kept very busy, Judy, and on very important research questions too. So I'm delighted to hear that you're going to be looking into all those important questions and looking forward to seeing the outcomes. And it's just fantastic to hear about the, you know, the future studies that you're going to be looking towards. I'm going to end at my last question, and then I'm going to open up to everyone else. I could keep talking all day, but my last question is going to be, what advice would you give young women looking to follow in your footsteps?
So I think you have to be interested in research to do it. So, I mean, I have at various points in my career thought, oh, I don't want to do this anymore. You know, it's just too much effort, too much hard work. And in the end, I can't help myself. I just want to know the answer. I just, you know, I don't want to leave it to someone else. I want to find out why this is happening and what's going on here. And so that has been what's propelled me. And I think you have to have that real interest in wanting to know the answers. And if you've got that, then you've just got to try and find a way through. And as I've said before, don't let anything stand in your way. Don't worry about the impact of family. Don't worry about the impact of, you know, of personal life. Everything is always inconvenient. Nothing fits as you would like it, but there's a way through, and you've just got to keep finding that way through. You may sometimes have to take a sideways step. As I said before, not so much now as probably in the past, but if you keep asking questions and you keep your interest, you will shine through. People will see that you have things to do, things to say, and they will, you know, they will continue to try and help you. So you should really have belief in yourself and don't give up. You know, just keep going. It's not, you know, it's so much nicer when you get to the point of being a PI. You know, if you're at a junior position now, just keep going, because when you get to be a PI, then you can ask the questions you want to ask, not what your boss is asking, but the questions you want to ask, and you can regulate your time much more and that kind of thing. So it's really worth keeping going if you're interested.
So for anyone who may be having doubts, just listen to Judy and just try keep going and keep thinking about your future ambitions and your goals of research projects. So thank you very much, Judy. That's just such interesting topics to hear about. And I'm going to stop now myself and try to let everybody else have a word in. So I see we've got some questions coming through. The first one I'm going to come to in the chat box, and then I'll come to Kate and Sharon. The first one from the chat box is, what is your typical working day? Do you work evenings and weekends?
So my typical working day is to work early morning. I find I just crash in the evening, and I have to watch mindless TV or something, you know, just or go to bed early or something. I'm a morning person. I tend to start work quite early, sort of probably about 7:30. And I tend not to work in the evenings just because I can't. I come home, I cook a meal because I find that relaxing. And then I sort of just chill usually, unless I've got a really important deadline. But if I have a deadline, I usually try and get up early and do it. I have worked weekends probably all my life. I'm trying to reduce that now, actually. And I think the thing is, I mean, that's one of the great things about families. You can't work the whole time if you've got kids, because they won't tolerate it. So they have been the people who've stopped me working all the time. I am naturally quite a hard worker, but I actually now think, I mean, my feeling is that actually one needs time off, and especially during the last year and a half, when the opportunity to just keep working and being on Zoom has been, you know, there's been nothing stopping you doing that. There's been no breaks. You can't just get up and, you know, go walk to the next meeting or something like that. I've become a firm believer in actually having, you know, time off at the weekends, and it's really important. And I think it doesn't make you any more productive if you work all the time. So I now work much less at weekends, and I don't work evenings. If I need to work, I get up early and work in the morning. Thank
you very much, Judy. I've got two hands up here, so I'm going to come to Kate, who put it up first, and then to Sharon. So Kate, over to you.
Thanks, Catherine. Judy, that was really interesting to listen to and really fascinating. I guess I have one question around Catherine's last question. We talked a little bit about inspiring next generation, I think, you know, as a young female, I think there were two things that almost put me off the you know, a career within science, and that was you know, girls from disprivileged backgrounds and not having that particular privilege around them, and also being a girl and then a woman in sometimes quite male orientated sectors. And you know, I remember my first lab manager telling me that she was enforced to wear a skirt when she first started out in her particular lab, and those days have definitely gone. But you know, I've definitely experienced times of being challenged for being a female in, you know, a particular male-orientated environment or something. So I just wonder what your kind of thoughts of and kind of advice were around those two particular points.
So I think that, I hope it's less prevalent nowadays, but they used to, I mean, certainly when I was, you know, growing up, there was I definitely encountered overt misogyny and sexism. I mean, I think I told Catherine, I went for one job, and in my interview, they asked me, do I have children? I said, yes, I've got one. And then they asked me, do you intend to have any more? And I said, probably, yes. And then they said, well, women with children don't do well in medicine and science. And of course, I didn't get the job. So that was the most overt of it. And as I said, I think I would love to go back and flaunt myself in front of the guy who said that, except I can't remember his name. He was so insignificant that I just can't remember who he was. I mean, I know where he worked, but I can't remember his name. So I think that I mean, obviously it's illegal now to be overtly misogynist in that way, or sexist. So I think that, you know, hopefully people are less like that. But I think there is always, you know, there's still sexism, there's still misogyny. You know, for example, mansplaining. You know, you go to a meeting, you say something, and then a minute later, somebody repeats it. You know, exactly what you've said in a different way, and everybody takes notice of them. That's always going to go on. But I think you've got to have a hard skin, and actually, I think you have to have a thick skin, even if you're a man in science. You know, science is about, in the end, often about the individual. You know, people are judged by what they are doing and what they have done. And to survive, you've got to develop a thick skin. And I'm sometimes quite hard on my postdocs. I mean, I will say to them, this is just not very good. This is no good. And I'm telling you this because I can tell you. And it's important that I tell you this before somebody else does. And I'm going to be horrible to you before someone else is, because you've got to learn how to stand up for yourself with things. So I think that, you know, having a thick skin is really important, but also you know, having a bit of self-belief, and remembering that, you know, people who think they're big often, you know, have, you know, hidden chips that they're trying to hide on their shoulders and things like that, and just, you know, not take them too seriously and ignore them. Actually, just ignore them. And the other thing is, always remain civil. Don't rise to things. I mean, it's really important, because you then have the upper hand. If you remain civil and you say, you think inwardly, what an idiot, and then you just sort of, you know, deal with it. I think that's a really good sort of attitude to learn. I found that, I mean, I'm not as good at it as some, but I've tried to do that as much as possible.
Thank you, Judy. Very, very powerful advice there, and I hope everybody can take a bit from that into their careers. Sharon, over to you.
Thank you very much. Well, Judy, that was so interesting listening to you speak. I've learned a lot today. I wanted to ask you about imposter syndrome. There's quite an interesting discussion going on actually at the moment about whether imposter syndrome is about the individual, and it's about what the individual feels about themselves, or actually whether it might be something different, and that is to do with actually systematic bias that people continuously hit up against in their own working environment. And so I just wonder what your, I think that's a really interesting discussion, but I wonder what your experience is. You know, have you come across people that say, I've got imposter syndrome? What would you say to those people?
So everybody has imposter syndrome. I have it hugely. And I think that to think that other people don't have it. And I think it's true for most women and quite a lot of men as well, that they feel that, you know, they're not good enough to be doing what they're doing or saying what they're saying. I mean, the reverse of that is when I can do something, I suddenly devalue it. I suddenly think, oh, well, if I can do it, then it must be really easy to do and everybody can do it. And so that is almost the reverse. I think women have that a lot. I think the thing that always helps me is to think that when I feel I've made a real fool of myself, if I've said something at a meeting, or if I feel I'm not actually projecting what I want to say properly, or I'm not really arguing something, I always say to myself, the person who remembers this is you. Everybody else will have moved on. And that's the thing you have to train yourself, I think, to do, which is to say that, imposter syndrome, I think it may be fanned by attitudes and expectations. I'm sure of that, but it is often about the individual, being sensitive to that. And I think that, young people who don't have imposter syndromes can make as big fools of themselves as people who do have imposter syndrome, but just forget it. And if you just have to look at MPs, you just have to think to yourself, remember all those MPs who have completely bombed and said all sorts of stupid things and then come back and act as if nothing's happened. I think it is about training yourself. It's got to be about training yourself not to dwell on your mistakes, because the person who remembers them is you, and other people don't remember them nearly as much. So yeah, I mean, it's a big issue, and it remains an issue. I don't know about for you, but it certainly remains an issue for me now. Everything I do, I think I wasn't as good as that person. I didn't express myself as well as this person. And then I just say to myself, get it, move on, next thing, because otherwise one can't function. And I think for people coming up, you have to remember that certainly most women and quite a lot of men, I think, have imposter syndrome. And they are just dealing with it. They're just kind of learning to actually push it to one side and move forward. Because otherwise you would spend your whole life, that would completely put you off, and you can't do that.
That's really interesting, Judy. I just wonder how old you have to get before you stop. You have to get in your life before you stop having imposter syndrome, because I haven't got to that stage yet.
No.
But I'm hoping to grow up one day.
Exactly.
Get out of it.
Because I don't think you ever do. And I think, you just get hardened to it, and you accept it, and you recognize it, and you try to move on. You never lose it, I think. You're that sort of person. I'm sure it's a sign of being a sensitive person and, empathetic and things like that. So we have to keep hold of that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. I've got two final questions, and then I'm going to have to hand over to Sharon to close, unfortunately. One from the chat, and then the next one from Katrina, who'd like to ask you in person. So the first one from the chat is, with hindsight, is there anything you would like or anything you would change about your career?
I can't honestly say that I can think of anything at this point. I mean, there are things I would have liked to have done, but I wasn't able to, often for personal reasons. So I think, looking back, I can't think that there is anything particularly that I would have changed now. I mean, I enjoy what I do so much now that I can't really honestly say, I can't think of what I could have changed that would have made it better than what I do now, because I really enjoy what I do now. So I'm a bit boring. I can't think of anything. I mean, there always will be things, but there's nothing that stands out.
Thanks, Judy. I'm going to hand over to Katrina, who's the next question.
Thank you, Judy. This is really, really interesting, and I think empowering and inspirational. So thank you for being so open and candid with us. I wanted to ask a question about collaboration. So collaborations obviously are really important in research and science, in life. So do you have any tips for how you would build strong and lasting and fruitful, productive relationships in the area where everyone is so competitive, and where, so how do you strike that balance?
Well, I think some of my best collaborations have been people who saw me as a young researcher and mentored me, actually. So people who've become collaborators, who've become really good friends over the years. I think if you have ideas and you want to do things, then that leads naturally to collaborations. And I think building collaborators around ideas, around shared interests and shared goals, is a really good way to do it. So often, if if you have an idea about a grant or something, and you write to somebody and say, I really like your work on this, I'm thinking of doing that, would you be interested in having a discussion about it? And I've done that a couple of times with people, and they've become really good friends and really good collaborators. So I think it's around, ending up with strong collaborations is about having ideas that can be used, can be worked on together. And then whether it sort of lasts as a collaboration depends really on, I think, personal contact. I mean, if you then are able to get on together, then it will persist and you'll collaborate for life. If you find that the person is not quite, on your wavelength, then you may collaborate for one grant and then move off to other things. I mean, in the end, you have to sort of like and respect the people that you want to work with. And I think that's the way forward with good collaborators.
I'm conscious of the time, and I know that Joel has been very patient. So Joel, will give you the very last question. Please keep it short if possible, and then we'll pass over to Sharon to close the meeting. So Joel, over to you for the final question. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Catherine. Sorry. Hi, Judy. I just wanted to, on behalf of all the virologists in the UK, thank Judy, because I don't think anybody will challenge the question about who the VZV queen of UK and Europe is, because I passed my exams, my Royal College exams, by giving that answer. They kept quizzing me about a varicella zoster complicated question, to the point where I put my head up and said, I'd probably call Professor Breuer about this. And they said, correct answer. And that's how I cleared the exam. So thank you so much for all you do, Judy. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. That's great. That's really good.
Thank you, Joel. And thank you again, Judy, for being our speaker today. It was definitely an amazing story, and I'm so grateful that you shared it. So Sharon, over to you, please.
Thanks very much. Well, what a wonderful last question and comment that was from Joel, and the Queen of Virology. So now we know it for sure. So thanks so much, Judy, for coming to talk to us at the Women in COG event. It's been absolutely fantastic to hear you speak. Thanks for everyone for joining us, actually, because actually the audience really bring this alive. Just one final thing to say, I'd like to invite you to the next session that we have. It's on the 15th of July, and we're fortunate to have joining us then Angela Douglas, MBE, who since 2018 has been the Deputy Chief Scientific Officer at NHS England and Improvement. So I hope you'll join us again next month, and wishing you a very pleasant afternoon. Goodbye to everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you.